Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. Happy New Year, everybody. I am jet lagged. Yay.
Live and hungover. Happy New
I
Year.
am jet lagged. To me, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and I've already been awake for a couple of hours. So, yay, life is good. Anyway, no. So, Australia was great. I'm back, and this week we're talking about hospitality. Next week, I have yet to confirm the details, but we should have Charlie Jane Anders coming to talk on the show, which would be really, really awesome, about all the birds in the sky. So we're going to cross our fingers that all the previously laid plans are going to go through, and I will update you on how and when that will be happening. However, okay, here we are. So today we're talking about hospitality, and was this one of your suggestions, Glenda? Because you're always making.
I don't remember. It could be.
Somebody suggested this one to me, and I thought it was actually very, very cool. I started thinking about hospitality rules, and actually there's some very interesting wrinkles in hospitality rules. So, like, hospitality. Okay, so what's it about? It's about inviting people to your home, right? Is that all that it's about? No, because they have hospitality suites, right? So I think part of it is inviting people to your home, but it has a sort of a wider meaning as well, which is sort of welcoming people, right?
Yeah.
But I think that whole hospitality suite thing is an extension of the concept rather than a core piece of the concept.
Actually, what just jumped to my mind was the British royalty who would make a journey to various subjects' homes, and the subjects really didn't have a whole lot of say in the fact that they were going to host the entire royal party.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was backbreaking for them.
Yeah.
So, hospitality drives Tolkien's plots, right? I mean,
tell me about that.
Well, Bilbo is required to be hospitable when dwarves keep showing up.
Oh, that's true.
And Beorn is required to be hospitable when dwarves keep showing up, and Elrond is required to be hospitable when dwarves keep showing up. And when the ring shows up, he's also required to be hospitable. And they're always saying "at your service" and all this.
Yeah.
Formulaic, but on some level literal. Hospitality drives a Game of Thrones at the beginning when the king does that thing that the English kings do, which is shows up in Winterfell with his full court. And much mayhem ensues from that. And he basically says, I'm here not just because I wanted to visit you, but I want you to be my hand back in King's Landing, and that makes everything go, right?
Right. And I was actually going to remark that it also, if you read Hild by Nicola Griffith, the king is constantly traveling around and staying with these various people who owe him fealty, and part of it is that he can't stay any one place for very long without exhausting all of its resources.
Sure.
And part of it is that, in a way, by going to a place and exhausting its resources, he keeps it bound to him, right?
Absolutely.
So
Shakespeare uses this all over the place. King Lear is based. The idea is like, okay, I'm going to retire and I'm going to go hang out with this son-in-law and that son-in-law and that son-in-law.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be beautiful. Everything will work out fine.
Yeah, sure.
And it can be absolutely a signifier of evil people or bad times for hospitality rules to get broken in these stories. There's in Wagner's Ring Cycle, hospitality plays a huge part in Siegfried. No, sorry, so the second one in Die Valkyrie. Siegfried's parents meet because of hospitality. Sieglinde is the wife of Hunding, and Sigmund, unbeknownst to anyone, her twin brother, by Wotan, because this is Wagner, is basically throws himself on the mercy of Hunding as a guest, and because of that, Hunding who decides he doesn't like Sigmund and wants to kill him, is verboten from killing him for 24 hours, or basically he has to be a host, because the society requires it. He is principal devotee of the goddess Hera, who is the wife of no, not Hera, whatever. Anyway, Wotan is Wotan's wife, who's escaping me. Frigga. Thank you. I was doing the Greek. He's a devotee of her, and of course she's also a goddess of hearth and hospitality and this and that. So, so he has to not kill Sigmund until he kicks him literally off his property, and then he can go kill him. And that drives that plot. And then the fourth opera in Get to Dämmerung, there are another brother and sister, and Gudrun and God, what was his name? Gudrun and dude who gets killed, and then their half brother Hagen, and Siegfried comes and he's their guest, the son of Sigmund and Sieglinde, comes and he's their guest, but they have very poor hosting skills, and they use a magic potion to erase his memory of Brunhilde and cause all sorts of mayhem. And so they're like terrible hosts, and that's part of their character flaw, right? Well,
so. I was going to actually remark that you can also find this in Dante.
Oh yeah.
There is a special region of hell for people who have been traitors to their guests.
And I'm sure it's nasty.
Yes. Yes, it's a place where people get frozen while still alive. Yeah. It's kind of awful. Yeah.
Sounds like the ninth circle somewhere in there.
There are lots of circles here. Yeah.
Yeah, so the way Dante worked is the worse the crime, the lower you got. So if you're in the ninth circle, that's it, man. That's traitors and scumbags and all the people from Mos Eisley Spaceport. They wind up there, It's just not good. But
I mean, I did feel it was. I actually used it as a plot point / line in this book that will someday come out in a different format from what it currently is, but it was really fun to be able to go into the text and use some of these details and go, oh yeah, this will be really fun. I can have this guy threaten him because basically for being a traitor to his guest. So, hey Morgan, joining us! Yay! Well, Happy New Year!
Thank you. You too.
We're here to be hospitable to you.
That would make a nice change for what's... No, that's not fair. If people are good.
No, we're just talking about hospitality, that's all. So I'm making...
that's a great thing. Yeah. I saw that and said, I better show
So
up.
far we've talked about Tolkien and George R. R. Martin and Shakespeare and Wagner.
And Nicola Griffith.
Build.
Yeah. So there's a lot of hospitality going around. So let's go into the real world a little bit. It's kind of interesting. Yes, I remember the context in which this originally came up because it was a while ago. The context in which this originally came up was we were talking about whether Halloween was a hospitality holiday.
I'd say yes.
Well, right, exactly, because all of a sudden you have to accept random strangers knocking on your doors and give them candy. Now, you don't have to invite them in, right?
Yeah, Passover is a hospitality holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes,
it's a ritualized opening of the door and saying, everyone come and eat who is hungry.
That's a good one, yeah.
Yeah, that is true.
I
And
think
I would argue that at least one Christmas Carol is playing off that tradition in an aggressive and coercive way, which is we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now come give us a figgy pudding. Basically, the subsequent verses are, we're not going to stop singing until you feed us, and then we will go away.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
we won't go until we get some, right?
Premise is Halloween.
Yeah. Now, is that more or less aggressive than trick or treat?
I think it's actually.
I'd say it's more aggressive because you're asking for baked goods. And also you're like doing it at a time when no one expects you to be aggressive about it, right? Like trick or treat, everyone expects you to be aggressive.
Yeah, but you can be more aggressive if you don't get your treat.
No, sure, you can do all sorts of horrific
things. If you don't get your figgy pudding, you're just going to sit there and sing on the doorstep.
Which could be pretty horrific after the 100th repetition of 99 bottles of eggnog on the wall.
Yeah, but I think it's not as bad as like egging your house or something.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Easier to clean up.
It's a different kind of torture.
But so under most conditions, I don't think people are required to take anyone in. And I think it's actually, like not these days.
Not even your family.
Yeah.
Well, these days the Syrian refugee crisis is all about hospitality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
What you're required and what you're socially required and legally required to do.
That's a good point. But that's also an extreme situation.
Yeah.
Students.
You
International student exchange.
If somebody knocks on your door, you're not required to take them in.
No.
But historically there have been times and places where one was required to provide shelter to travelers.
Yeah, and I think so. And in fact, I think the more isolated and the more dangerous the environment, the more likely you're going to have hospitality rules about taking people in.
Which is why in the biblical stories it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like Abraham takes people in like all the time because they're in the desert. There are stories in Torah and about angels disguised as guests, and they're litmus tests for hospitality. And in other mythological histories, like Odin, Wotan, used to go around all the time disguised as an old man testing hospitality. Other Greek gods did that. It's a big thing, right? The whole like divine being disguised as a sort of a pathetic traveler whom you really wouldn't want in your house, and whether you're hospitable or not determines all sorts of things. The folk ballad King Henry is about being hospitable to a completely unreasonable being who, like, she's like, give me more meat. I want, give me your horse. I'm going to eat your horse. And then give me your favorite hunting dog. I'm going to eat your favorite hunting dog. And, when he does all of those things, which are completely unreasonable demands, then, she turns into a perfect romantic partner.
After
all that, yes, magic.
I'm not really sure how that is.
Yeah, I can totally get it. It's very, very interesting.
So hospitality rules in story test the moral character of the host. What they're designed to do. They're designed to reveal to the reader or the listener or the viewer what kind of person you're dealing with, but it also does double duty driving a plot.
Well, so I think I'm going to get to Morgan's point in a second. So I think, in fact, that given that we, when we're writing stories, one of the things that we like to do is show our friends and readers that a character is a good person or a bad person. That this is actually one way that you could show that your character is a good or a bad person by testing their hospitality in the context of the plot. Right? I mean, because it's been something that's used that way traditionally.
Right.
And very effectively, again, because it can do double duty, right? As like in Bilbo Baggins, right? Like it literally gets him on the adventure, but also tells us he's a good guy.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like he's completely freaking out with 14 guests, and they're eating him out of house and home. They're threatening to throw his dishes away and break his plates and do all this and and he's doing it right. Like he's totally like he doesn't have a butler or anything.
He's
He's
not
just
throwing him out.
running himself ragged, being a good host.
Yeah, and I think Morgan actually brought up something really interesting, which is international student exchange programs.
Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting instance of hospitality, and I've done it. I think it's really interesting when you get matched with strangers. Yeah. Right? It can be very challenging, and I haven't done that instance in my adult life, but actually when I was a kid, my family did it. And it was very, very rewarding, but also very challenging, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm going to tell you, it's raining right now, and I'm so happy. I'm like, oh, I can hear the rain. It makes me so happy.
Yes, which is El Nino, which reminds me of the Christmas Story, which is all about a lack of hospitality.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
but another form of hospitality is adoption.
Uh-huh.
And that drives a lot of plots. Who gets adopted and who doesn't. Star Wars is based on adoption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? As
a
major plot element. And The Empire Strikes Back, Lando Calrissian's big sin is he was a bad host.
Yeah.
Right? He was a duplicitous host who who sells out his guests to the Empire.
Well, he was between a rock and a hard place. I'd hate to be him as a host, honestly.
Right, but he caves, right?
He does. I agree.
That's why he has a character arc.
Yes, exactly.
Well, there's also many stories about dishonest guests who accept hospitality and then betray the host.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not supposed to break bread with someone and then kill them.
Well, there's vampire mythology.
Steal from them.
Ooh,
you
the
have
vampire
to
where
invite
you
them
have to invite them in, right?
And if they're invited in, they're bad guests. Right? Like really bad guests.
Yeah.
They certainly have the potential to be.
So they're kind of predators taking advantage of the hospitality rules.
Mm.
They're opportunistic predators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were talking about places that were like deserts where you are required to
render aid.
Take people in.
Yeah.
What about dangerous cities and whatnot where it might be risky to invite people in, where it's risky to invite them in than it is to keep them out for you, and the potential clash in cultures of someone from another environment, coming into from a desert environment, coming into a city and saying, "What's wrong with you people? It's dangerous out here. You're supposed to let me in." Or somebody going the other way and not expecting aid, not asking for it.
Yeah.
Because that's not where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a plot element as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in this country, we've had these terrible instances of people who have had accidents and need help showing up at somebody's door and getting shot.
Yeah.
That's a failure of hospitality.
Oh, in a big way.
In a huge way. I mean, it's a racist failure of hospitality, but it's like it shows you some of the inherent conflict in something that seems relatively straightforward, right? Like, what could go wrong? Well, here's an example of some things that could go terribly, terribly wrong because of, racism, city environment, whatever it is, right? Because in my neighborhood, if I saw a kid who had gotten injured, I would absolutely take them in,
Yeah.
I just think sometimes of people sitting in terrible and unsafe circumstances because they can't tell if it's more dangerous to sit in their car or bleeding than it might be to go up to a house and ask for aid. Which one is the more dangerous thing to do? Which one is going to get you killed faster?
I'm thinking too, though, about specific forms of hospitality and cultural differences.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see a lot of potential for misunderstanding between people, the host and the guest are from different cultures.
Yeah.
And they both think they're behaving according to the rules, but they have very different concepts of what the rules of hospitality are.
Right. Well, I'll tell you a little joke that we learned about when we were visiting the Netherlands. Okay. And it's sort of a hospitality thing. In the Netherlands, the host will keep feeding you until you stop eating. In Japan, you're supposed to keep eating until the host stops serving. So if you ever get a Japanese businessman in a Dutch home, it could be quite painful for the Japanese businessman by the end of the night.
Oh, yeah.
It's like strapping a cat to a piece of buttered toast to get a hovering device.
Right. Yeah.
Another form of hospitality I just thought of is hitchhiking.
Oh, yes.
And all the rules about that, and so many plots are driven by hitchhiking.
Yep.
Hitchhiker, the hitchhikey, whatever, right? And where one or the other breaks the expectation. And then, of course, there's the urban myth of the vanishing hitchhiker, someone who died in a car wreck, and you're kind enough to give that person a ride, and then they vanish the next day, and you tell everyone about it at the truck stop. They're like, oh, yeah, he or she died 5 years ago to this very night, on a stormy night just like this, But sometimes the supernatural hitchhiker will leave a present or a gift of some sort for the person kind enough to give them a ride.
That's interesting.
I'm thinking of a supernatural rerun we saw the other night of a demon who needed to make a call. So she took a ride and had the driver hitchhiked, had the driver pull over, and of course there's this pretty young woman, and he thinks he's gonna get something from her, and instead she slits his throat and takes his blood and uses it to do this ritual, which is obviously a supernatural hitchhiker. But I just thought of that because I saw it the other night. Just maybe a little extreme.
Yeah, that's extreme. Poor guest response. Like they let you in and you kill them and you take their stuff. That's the bad guest.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Shoot. Oh, yeah. Okay. So there was something else that I wanted to mention, which is that when you have international guests, or when you have guests who are coming from far away, the rules around hospitality can be different. Right? So, for example, we love to have guests from overseas because we have lots of international friends. So, whenever we have guests come over, we put them on our sofa beds and we feed them, and they stay with us as though they're part of the family, right?
Sure.
But when we go to France, we get the same kind of treatment. We're taken in, we're treated like part of the family, we're fed, we're this, we're that. there's a place for us. When we go to Japan, we have to get a hotel that's near the person's home because the homes are so small that they just cannot fit you in there, right? Mm-hmm. And so the hospitality consists of, it's a little bit of a different deal, right? So instead of actually having you in their home and treating you like you're part of the family, what they'll do is they will help you to arrange for a hotel that's very convenient to the location of their home, and then they will feed you as much as possible. Sure. But it's kind of interesting, right? Because it's like, if you have the expectation that you'll be in the home, then that's actually a pretty unusual situation. Both my brother and I had homestays that we did when we were in school. My brother did it when he was in high school, and I did mine when I was in college. And we homestayed with families in Japan. And at this point, I'm realizing that that's actually a pretty unusual situation, right?
Was it out in the countryside somewhere?
Well, my brother homestayed in Osaka, and I homestayed in Kyoto. So
those are pretty big cities.
They're pretty big cities, but they aren't Tokyo.
Right.
Right? I mean, basically Tokyo is the exception to all rules. And I think, I'm trying to think of what I know from Japanese folktales, what kind of hospitality rules there have been.
It depends on your social class, right? I mean,
Probably.
the historical story and all of the plays and movies and whatever based on the 47 Ronin is based on a hospitality situation where all of the daimyos are guests of the shogun and one of them draws a weapon, which is a bad guest rule, and undoes his entire household as a result. You know.
Actually, this is actually really interesting. So, because you've made me think of the thing that the shogun used to do in order to keep control over the provinces.
Yeah, we travel.
He would force the local rulers to live with him for half the year.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
I'd forgotten that he brought them in. Yeah, and then he separated them from their power base.
He separated them from their power base.
Forced them to play politics with each other. Yeah. Yeah, well, that happens in Europe as well, and that there's the season, right? Everyone, like in England, goes to London or whatever. All the country, originally the feudal lords would all go and be centralized, and then later it was just the aristocracy, and it was a social thing, right? But you had to do it because you had to play politics, and you had to display your wealth to somebody. And who cares if you're displaying your wealth at home to your subjects and retainers? You have to display it to the king and your fellow lordlings so that they know you're powerful. Right?
Yeah.
And so spend a lot of money, which has the added advantage as far as the king is concerned, that all of his lordlings are spending lots of money that he doesn't have to spend, and thus burning up their resources.
Yeah.
And thus he gets to acquire while they burn through their money, and that gives him a monetary advantage so that he can't get deposed as easily.
Yep.
Yeah. I've been remembering
the kings fostering the children of.
Oh yeah, after a war.
Which again, ostensibly hospitality on the part of the king, but actually a combination of hostage and brainwashing.
Yeah, that's a big part of Game of Thrones. The Song of Fire and Ice and Fire, whatever, where the Greyjoys were defeated sometime before the first book, and the Lord of Winterfell has Theon Greyjoy as a fosterling, or basically hostage, and wacky mayhem ensues.
Wacky mayhem. Somehow, wacky mayhem seems to be something that ensues a lot in George R.R. Martin's work.
Yeah, well, in this case, it may have just been regular mayhem.
Yeah, and you're making me think of, there was also, not just in Game of Thrones do they have fostering, but also Anne McCaffrey's Pern has fostering, but it's a different type of fostering, which I think is actually interesting to look at.
Not remembering that.
Because it's like a craft house fostering, a guild fostering.
Sure.
And that is intended not to be a hostage kind of situation, but it's a hospitality situation, and it's also designed to keep skills from dying out in their tiny local areas.
Mm.
So what's the difference?
The Jedi do that too in Star Wars.
So what's the difference between that situation, the hosting at the craft halls, and an apprenticeship?
It is like apprenticeship, except that apprenticeship doesn't require you to travel.
Right. Okay.
You can. I
You
mean,
can apprentice in the same town or a different town.
Well, so like the Pern situation, I think, is interesting because the entire society is under threat from Threadfall, and so it would be possible for an entire village or town to be wiped off the map. Not
Right.
super likely, but it would be possible.
Yeah.
And travel between the towns and travel between these places is actually quite difficult and possibly dangerous or deadly, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that difficulty, and because of the fact that this place might be wiped out, that's the reason why they foster the apprentices to different locations in order to spread the specialties of a
knowledge.
particular area.
Right. So that it doesn't die out. Yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So yeah, that's actually really interesting. Really interesting fictional example. That yay! I'm glad we got around to that one.
Yeah.
There was also historically Niall of the Nine Hostages. Do you know this guy? He's a pretty notorious guy. He was King of Ireland. King of Ireland in about 400. Okay. And he is actually an ancestor of about 1/8 of Irishmen. Because he had this enormous territory, and the way that he kept control over the territory was by taking hostages from each territory, and these hostages were women.
Mm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was not only a forced hospitality, hostage sort of situation, but it was also, hey, I can spread my seed through the entire region sort of situation. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and actually they used to think he might be mythical, but then they actually found the grave of his son.
Ah.
And the grave of his son was in northern France.
Huh.
And that was one of the regions that Niall actually controlled.
So that's not a violation of hospitality, with regards to the women? How is that?
It probably is.
Who's going to stop him? You and what army?
Yeah, right.
No.
Which means it's a forced taking them into the hostage situation, wouldn't it
And
be?
you know what? It's hard to know how that was spun at the time.
Yeah.
So
Sounds more like a bride
forward
kidnapping.
rape.
Yeah.
Or it could have been something where it was like, oh, you get to be one of my wives, aren't you? Aren't you happy about it? And some of them might have been.
Right.
Right? Because they might have felt that being close to power was somehow to their advantage or whatever. Right? It's
To the
really
advantage
hard
of
to
their
know
family.
based on the situations of the individual women.
At least one of his sons did well enough to have a nice tomb in France.
I've heard stories, I don't know if there's any historical precedent for it, where in extremely isolated villages, a male traveler was actually expected to sleep with his host's wife or daughter in hope of promoting genetic diversity.
With an understanding that
Where
that was
was
a
this,
good
Glenda?
thing.
I've seen it in stories, but I don't know if there's any historical precedent for it, or if somebody just made it up out of whole cloth.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of the other sort of sexual privilege, forced hospitality sort of thing, which is from the Marriage of Figaro. You guys know the story of the marriage?
Oh yeah, right. So he's got his ward and he wants to marry her.
Roi du Seigneur, right? So he's supposed to be taken in by, the intended wife of one of his servants,
Right.
and he's supposed to be able to have her before the night before the guy marries her. Because Lord, and that's totally cool.
Yeah, well, that was one of that whole Lord's privilege thing. There's a
Right, Seigneur or something. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, it's Roi du Seigneur, yeah.
Yeah, that. I know I've read different things about the historical accuracy. I've read that it really happened, and I've read that it never happened, but was used as a trumped-up charge for the peasantry to revolt. That the claim of this happening. So I'm not really sure of the historical accuracy, but it's certainly driven fiction.
Yeah, well,
I just have a hunch it probably did happen somewhere.
Yeah, I'm guessing it probably did.
I don't know how widespread, however.
Yeah, I don't know.
The way things were done, but I'm sure it was done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the flip side of hospitality is slavery, right? And slavers took all sorts of advantages.
Yeah.
Maybe you were poor or whatever, traveling, and you wind up at the wrong house, and they, offer you dinner, and you wake up and change.
Yeah, yeah.
That can happen. And so
it's bad hosting.
It is bad hosting, but profitable if you don't mind the lack of repeat business. Then
Yeah. I was thinking to go back to Passover and Halloween and other expectations. The expectation of hospitality for Passover is a very specific purpose and a very specific time.
Mm-hmm.
You can come in, we'll feed you, and then you go away again.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also other hospitality rules that say, we take you in, we shelter you, we feed you, and that's for as long as you need it.
Yeah.
Which of these things apply? How do you know which of these things is going to apply in a given situation? I mean, if somebody comes in on Passover and needs shelter and food for an indefinite period of time, you can't very well send them away just because Passover's done.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is always that sort of guests are like fish.
Yes.
Smell after 3 days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of...
These are guests who have some control over where they go. They have other places to go once they leave, as opposed to people that you're supposed to host because they're travelers on the road or they have no other place to go, refugees. basically.
Yeah, right, right. Actually, and I'm going to mention one more instance that you just made me think of, which is children moving back in with their parents.
Like fish.
Well, it's interesting because I've actually seen. I can think off the top of my head of 3 instances of children living with their parents, like after they've left once and then come back.
Sure.
And I think actually it's probably happening more now because some of the economic difficulties that have been going on.
Much more common than it used to be.
Yeah, right.
When I left for college, the expectation was I might come home for a few summer breaks, but that would be it.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Well, I mean, the expectation for me once I went to college was, of course, when you come back from school for breaks, you can live with us, right? But we expect you to be looking for a place to call your own, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And once you find that, you're done.
I had a place of my own. I was renting a place. I had some jobs, but then close to where I went to school. And then there was a better job close to where the job was in Manhattan. My family lives in New Jersey, a train ride from Manhattan. So that was sort of awkward moving back in with my parents because, I was making less than $12,000 a year, and even 30 years ago, that was, not enough to live in Manhattan. And that was quite awkward, and I felt really bad about it. And what my dad said was, you're not running away from something, you're going to something. And I think that made a big difference to them, knowing that. But it was still hard because I was an adult. I was used to having control over my own days,
Well, because in fact, when you're a child moving back home, you're caught in between being a child and actually being a guest, because you're not really a guest, right? Yeah. Because as a child, you have a particular role within the family structure, and you're part of the household, and so you have responsibilities of a particular sort. But once you're out of the house sort of has to reform itself and take care of itself without you. And then, okay, you're back. How much of that do you have to take back up, right? Are you really a guest? And all that kind of thing. I mean, I know some people, so for example, some people have their children who move back home pay rent.
Yeah.
And when you do that, what you're doing is you're saying you are, it's a way of defining the nature of the relationship, right?
Yeah.
If you're paying rent, you're not exactly a guest either, right?
Well, a boarder, someone who's boarding in your house, can be referred to as a paying guest.
Right.
So that's a sort of a contradiction put together in those terms, but guest is one of those terms. Right, and the arrangements are all over the map. I've been a paying guest when I was, young. I lived in a room. I rented a room in a house, and I had limitations to what I could do with the kitchen in the main house and what I couldn't do and stuff like that. Right, and those expectations will vary from anything like a student exchangey kind of situation to something like landlord-tenant, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the on-site landlord, and the whole spectrum, depending on how you arrange it. And then, of course, there's boarding houses, which everyone is a paying guest.
Mm-hmm.
But you have communal meals, maybe. That's part of the deal. Or a bed and breakfast, in which you are a paying guest, but you get breakfast. Which can be, and if you go year after year to the same place, you get to know them and whatever. And I have friends who were going to this bed and breakfast frequently enough that when the owners of the bed and breakfast decided to take a vacation, they called my friends and said, You want to run the place for a few months in the off season?
That's pretty funny.
So they did.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned bed and breakfast though, because bed and breakfasts in the U.S. typically are run like little hotels.
Yeah.
But bed and breakfasts in Britain that I've seen are actually people's homes that they've decided to welcome people into.
Mm.
So that's an interesting, or at least the ones that I've seen were people's homes. And so it's very different.
Well, the bed and breakfasts I've been to in the U.S. they're like mini hotels, but the owners live in them.
Yeah, right.
You might have a separate kitchen, and every bedroom is done up to be different from all the other bedrooms deliberately to make it feel like you're a guest in somebody's private house. So it's got that vibe, even though, you know, it's sort of half and half. Like the vibe is half hotel and half like you're at somebody's house.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Very interesting.
But I think that a lot of plots can and be and are driven by either breaking the rules of hospitality as a guest or a host, sticking to the letter of the rules but not the spirit, or that clash that Juliet was talking about with different expectations. You know, there's certainly a lot of drama in the traveler, you know, from a car wreck or a horse wreck or whatever it is, stumbling up to some unknown dwelling and deciding to ring the doorbell or knock on the door and see what happens, right? I mean, the Rocky Horror Show starts off that way, right?
It's actually really funny that we're talking about this today because I just started working on a story, and lo and behold, like, this is exactly the kind of issues that I'm talking about. It's really interesting. You know what? I'm going to have to run because we still have 4 minutes left, but I'm getting a call from my vet. So thank you all for being here. I will update you on Charlie Jane Anders for next week, and talk to you soon. Thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.